I'm a 28-year-old woman who just achieved a major life goal. I bought my first home. After years of saving and budgeting, I finally managed to get a cozy, small house in a nice neighborhood. It wasn't anything fancy, but it was perfect for me, a space I could call my own. It felt like the biggest accomplishment of my life, and I was so proud. My parents were thrilled when I told them. They offered to help with some light renovations, which I thought was really sweet of them. It seemed like a nice way to celebrate this new chapter, and they insisted it was just their way of supporting me. I agreed, thinking it would just be some minor painting or maybe a bit of landscaping. They were excited though, and the renovations quickly turned into regular visits. At first, it felt nice to have them around, but their helpful visits started getting a little too frequent. They'd drop by unannounced, and each time, they'd bring a new friend or a distant relative to see the progress on the house. I thought it was just a bit over the top, but I brushed it off as them being proud of my achievement. They've always loved showing off family accomplishments, especially since my younger sister, Jenna, is kind of the golden child in the family. Jenna is 3 years younger than me and has always been the center of my parents' attention. Growing up, they'd bend over backward for her, giving her everything she wanted. I love my sister, but it was no secret that she got a lot more than I did. If she wanted something, they'd make it happen. And recently, she got engaged to her boyfriend, who also seems to like the finer things in life. She's been planning a wedding fit for royalty, except she doesn't have a budget to match. One day, I overheard my parents talking about how expensive Jenna's wedding was turning out to be. They sounded stressed, going on about how the cost kept ballooning. I didn't pay much attention at the time. It made sense they'd want to make her day special, but it was clear they were feeling the pressure. Then things started getting strange. Out of the blue, my parents began asking me questions about my house's value and how much I still owed on my mortgage. They even asked if I'd ever thought about refinancing. I thought it was odd, but I didn't think too much of it. They've never been interested in my finances before, so I assumed they were just curious. A week later, they invited me over for a family dinner. They even insisted I bring along my mortgage and property documents just in case something happened. It was supposedly for safety reasons, but it felt unnecessary. Still, I didn't want to cause any trouble, so I agreed. Looking back, I should have been more suspicious. Around this time, I started hearing rumors from my neighbors. They'd casually mention seeing a house just like mine listed online. I was confused, but I shrugged it off as a coincidence. Then, a friend sent me a link to a real estate listing, my house, complete with photos of the interior. The pictures were from the renovations my parents had been helping with. My house was listed for sale, and I had no idea how or why. In shock, I confronted my parents. They immediately acted clueless, claiming they had no idea what I was talking about. They brushed it off, saying it must be some kind of mistake. Their dismissive tone threw me off. This was serious, and they barely reacted. It felt like they weren't telling me something, but I couldn't put my finger on it. Then a few days later, my bank called. They wanted to confirm a recent inquiry on my mortgage status, an inquiry made by an authorized family member. I hadn't authorized anyone to access my mortgage information, so this was news to me. I felt a wave of panic and confusion. Who else could have tried to access my account? The pieces were starting to come together, but I was still hoping it was some big misunderstanding. The final blow came when a real estate agent knocked on my door, ready to give a tour of the property. That's when it hit me. My house was, without a doubt, on the market. And not only that, but my own family was behind it. They'd gone behind my back to list my home, using the guise of renovation help to get access to the property and take the photos they needed. Standing in my living room with a real estate agent I'd never met, I felt a mixture of betrayal and disbelief. How could my own parents do this? It was surreal, like something out of a bad dream. Update 1. After discovering the house listing and connecting the dots, I went straight to my parents. I confronted them, this time with proof, the link to the real estate listing, complete with photos taken inside my house during their renovation visits. With this undeniable evidence, they couldn't pretend any longer. At first, they tried to brush it off as a misunderstanding, saying they had been exploring options just in case I ever decided to sell. But I pushed back, demanding a straight answer about why they would list my home without even asking me. Finally, they admitted it. They had listed the house to help fund Jenna's dream wedding. According to them, it was all for family happiness, and since I'd achieved my dream of owning a home, it was only fair to help Jenna achieve hers. They went on about how Jenna deserves the wedding of her dreams, and how the equity in my home could make it possible. My parents truly believed they had a say in how my home could be used because they'd helped me buy it, ignoring the fact that the only help they'd provided was a bit of free labor during renovations. That sense of entitlement was staggering. I made it crystal clear my house was not for sale, and it was certainly not a bank to fund Jenna's extravagant wedding. But they weren't willing to drop it. They tried every tactic in the book, even going as far as guilt-tripping me. They insisted I was putting money above family happiness and reminded me of how much they had done for me growing up. To them, my refusal to sell the house wasn't just a denial of Jenna's dream, but a rejection of the family itself. I didn't budge. I repeated that the house wasn't for sale, and that they had crossed a serious line by listing it without my permission. Then came the call from Jenna herself. She was in tears, angry and hurt, telling me that I was ruining her wedding and accusing me of being selfish. She claimed that I was putting my house above her happiness and that I had no right to deny her this one thing after all the support the family had given me over the years. It stung hearing those words, but I stayed firm, explaining that I wasn't obligated to give up my home to fund her wedding dreams. After that, I reached out to a few close friends, sharing the whole story. They were as shocked as I was and immediately reassured me that I had every right to protect my home. They encouraged me to stand my ground and reminded me that my family's behavior was way out of line. Talking with them helped me see how wrong it was for my parents and sister to think they had any claim on my property. Word quickly spread through the family, and reactions were mixed. Some relatives sympathized with me, saying it was ridiculous for my parents to list my home without my permission. Others, though, sided with my parents, insisting that I should help out for the sake of family unity. It felt like I was suddenly cast as the villain in this twisted story, all because I wouldn't sacrifice my home for a wedding. A few days later, my parents issued an ultimatum. Either I agreed to sell the house willingly, or I'd face the family's collective disappointment. They made it clear that if I didn't fall in line, I'd essentially be disowned. It was surreal to hear my own parents lay out such a harsh choice, all over a wedding that, in reality, had nothing to do with me. At that point, I knew I needed legal advice. I reached out to a lawyer, explaining the entire situation. The lawyer assured me that my family couldn't legally sell my house without my consent, but advised me to take a few precautionary steps. First, I should change all the locks to ensure no one could access the property without my permission. They also recommended securing any sensitive documents and valuables, just in case my parents attempted further interference. I followed their advice immediately, replacing the locks and securing my paperwork. But my parents didn't stop there. Shortly after our confrontation, they took their grievances to social media. They posted long, dramatic statuses about how I had turned my back on the family and was selfishly holding on to money that could make my sister's dreams come true. They painted me as some heartless villain, leading to an onslaught of comments from family friends and distant relatives, most of whom had no idea of the full story. It was painful to see people I barely knew judging me, but I refused to let it sway me. Then, Jenna's fiancé got involved. He reached out, trying to reason with me, saying I should consider the family's wishes and see how much happiness I could bring by making a small sacrifice. It was clear that the pressure was only going to keep building. I realized that if I wanted to protect myself and my home, I needed to be prepared for an even bigger confrontation. With that resolve, I prepared myself for whatever might come next. This was no longer about a house or a wedding, it was about standing up for myself and my rights. Update 2. After my conversation with the lawyer, I knew the next step was to take action. My lawyer drafted a cease and desist letter addressed to my parents, demanding they remove the listing and stop any unauthorized actions regarding my property. It was direct, laying out that they had no legal rights to the home and that any further interference could lead to serious consequences. Once my parents received the letter, their reaction was swift and intense. They were furious. Instead of backing down, they accused me of legal harassment and labeled the letter as a betrayal. They claimed I was dragging the family into unnecessary drama, all because of my selfish refusal to support my sister's wedding. That letter became the tipping point, further widening the already growing rift between us. Not only did my parents refuse to take any accountability, but they also decided to escalate things online. They posted a series of dramatic statuses on social media, painting me as the villain who was tearing the family apart over a little money. My mother posted about how I had turned against the family and how heartbroken she was that I would prioritize wealth over love. The posts were vague enough that people who didn't know the full story would assume I'd done something terrible, and it didn't take long before distant relatives and family friends started leaving comments in support of them. Some even sent me direct messages, accusing me of being heartless. Just when I thought things couldn't get worse, Jenna decided to confront me in person. She showed up unannounced at my house, clearly furious. She went on about how I was jealous of her happiness and insisted that my house had always been family property. According to her, I had no right to keep it all to myself when the family needed it for something as important as her wedding. I didn't raise my voice or get angry. I just clarified that the house was bought with my own hard-earned money, that it was legally mine, and that I had no intention of giving it up. That only seemed to make her angrier. She stormed off, leaving me to wonder how things had escalated so quickly. The next day, my parents called with a new demand. Since I wasn't willing to sell the house, they insisted I give them a large loan instead. They argued that, as family, I had an obligation to help them in any way I could, especially considering the once-in-a-lifetime nature of Jenna's wedding. I stayed calm and told them no, I didn't owe them anything, and their demands were getting out of hand. Their response was to cut off communication with me altogether. They stopped inviting me to family gatherings, and soon I started hearing from other family members who implied that I was the one who had abandoned everyone. It became clear that my parents were trying to isolate me, hoping the silent treatment would make me rethink my decision. The exclusion hurt, but my close friends stood by me. They reminded me that I was doing the right thing, and without their support, I'm not sure how I would have managed to keep my resolve. A few days later, I received a call from the real estate agent who had shown up at my house before. They informed me that, after the cease and desist letter, my parents had finally removed the listing. It was a relief, but I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. My suspicions were confirmed shortly after when I came home one evening and noticed that my locks looked different. It was subtle, but I could tell they had been tampered with. My first thought was that someone had tried to break in, possibly in retaliation for the legal letter. I immediately called a locksmith to replace all the locks again and decided it was time to install a security system. I didn't want to believe that my own family could stoop to this level, but after everything that had happened, I couldn't take any chances. The stress was starting to take a toll on me. I decided to start therapy to work through the emotional mess that this family betrayal had left me with. Every session helped me unpack the layers of guilt and manipulation that I hadn't even realized were affecting me. The therapist helped me see how deeply rooted these family dynamics were, and how setting boundaries, even with family, was okay. But my parents didn't stop. They continued their smear campaign within the extended family, creating a narrative where I was the selfish daughter who cared more about her money than keeping the family together. The story spread quickly, and before long, I was getting messages from relatives I hadn't spoken to in years, all expressing disappointment and accusing me of destroying family unity. In response, I started documenting every interaction with my parents, Jenna, and any family members who reached out. I wanted a clear record of everything that had been said and done, just in case things escalated again. Keeping a record also gave me a sense of control over the situation, as if I were finally taking steps to protect myself fully. Despite the chaos, I found my resolve growing stronger. Every attempt to guilt trip me, every rumor they spread, it all reinforced that I had made the right choice. I wasn't going to let anyone, not even my family, undermine the life I'd worked so hard to build. Update 3. Despite everything that had happened, I ended up attending a family gathering a few weeks later. I knew I'd be walking into a tense environment, but a part of me wanted to set the record straight with everyone who had been misled by my parents' one-sided version of events. I prepared myself for anything, knowing that this might be the only chance I'd get to explain the truth to some relatives who had completely bought into my parents' story. As soon as I arrived, the tension was palpable. Some relatives shot me disapproving glances, while others looked uncomfortable but curious. It didn't take long for someone to bring up the issue in a not-so-subtle way, questioning why I was refusing to help the family during such an important time. That was my opening. I calmly explained the entire situation, starting with how my parents had listed my house without my knowledge or permission. I laid out how they tried to pressure me into selling my own home to pay for Jenna's wedding, and how, when I refused, they'd turned to spreading rumors and isolating me. The more I spoke, the quieter the room got. Some relatives looked shocked, clearly hearing the full story for the first time. Others still seemed doubtful, holding on to the belief that my parents must have had good intentions. My parents didn't like being put on the spot. They began loudly accusing me of turning everyone against them, calling me a family pariah who had always put herself above everyone else. It was dramatic, and exactly the kind of reaction I'd expected. Their outburst didn't do them any favors, though. A few relatives actually stepped forward, saying they couldn't believe my parents had crossed so many boundaries, and that they'd had no idea things had gotten this out of hand. Just as I thought things might settle down, Jenna made her entrance. She stormed into the conversation, accusing me again of ruining her wedding and stealing her chance at happiness. She went on about how she'd always imagined her big day, and how my selfishness was the only reason she couldn't have it. Her fiancé stood nearby, visibly uncomfortable, but he didn't say anything. This time, I wasn't going to let her guilt trip me. I kept my voice steady and told her that I had every right to keep my home, and that her wedding was not my responsibility. At that point, I'd had enough. I turned to everyone and made it clear that if my parents or anyone else continued to interfere with my life, I would take further legal action. I was done with the manipulation, the guilt tripping, and the rumors. Any attempt to pressure me or sabotage my life would be met with consequences. The room fell silent, and even my parents seemed taken aback by my firmness. After that confrontation, things started to shift. A few extended family members came up to me privately, expressing sympathy and apologizing for believing the rumors. They admitted they'd been swayed by my parents' online posts and hadn't realized the full extent of what I'd been dealing with. It felt like a small victory, knowing that at least a few people understood my side. Feeling encouraged, I decided to take the story online. I shared a detailed account on a forum, laying out exactly what had happened, from the house listing to the family's escalating behavior. I didn't use any names, but the story was raw and honest. The response was overwhelming. Thousands of people commented, sharing their support, and even their own stories of family betrayal. Many encouraged me to stay strong, reminding me that setting boundaries was essential, even if it was painful. It didn't take long for my parents to find out about the post. They were furious, demanding that I take it down, claiming it was an invasion of family privacy. They were suddenly concerned about reputational damage, apparently oblivious to the fact that they'd already done plenty of harm with their own social media campaign. I refused. I told them that as long as they continued to spread lies about me, I'd keep the post up. I had every right to tell my side of the story. After that, I decided it was time to go fully no contact with my parents and Jenna. I blocked them on all communication channels and instructed my friends and relatives not to pass on any messages from them. Enough was enough. I needed to protect myself from their toxic behavior, and the only way to do that was by enforcing strict boundaries. A week later, I received a private message from Jenna's fiancé. He apologized for his role in the drama, admitting that he hadn't realized how manipulative my parents had been. He even said he'd tried talking to Jenna about moving forward without relying on my house money, but she hadn't been willing to listen. I thanked him for reaching out, but I knew this was still too little, too late. With the family out of my life, I finally felt a sense of relief. The security system I'd installed gave me peace of mind, and knowing that I had full control over my home again was empowering. I focused on rebuilding my stability, surrounding myself with friends who had supported me all along. They became my chosen family, the people I knew I could count on without question. I started finding new ways to enjoy my space, taking up hobbies and even hosting small gatherings with friends to fill my home with good memories. Each day, I felt more at peace, knowing that I was free from the drama and manipulation that had weighed me down for so long. That chapter with my family was finally closing, and I was ready to start fresh, creating a life defined by respect, trust, and independence. I'd learned a lot through this ordeal, and if there was one thing I'd take away from it, it was the importance of setting boundaries and standing up for myself, no matter who was on the other side. Update 4. A few weeks went by without any word from my parents or sister. I was finally getting used to the silence when, out of nowhere, an email from them popped up in my inbox. The subject line read, "Let's make amends." They wrote about how they realized the error of their ways and wanted to restore family unity. The timing felt suspicious, especially with Jenna's wedding only weeks away. The message was filled with subtle hints, emphasizing how wonderful it would be if I could put the past behind us and consider contributing to the wedding. They suggested we meet in person to talk things over, painting it as a chance for a fresh start. The tone sounded overly sweet, as if they were hoping I'd forget everything that had happened. I debated responding, knowing full well it could be another attempt to manipulate me. When I mentioned the email to my friends, they were immediately skeptical, reminding me how manipulative my family had been all along. Still, a part of me wanted to confront them one last time, just to see if they'd finally be honest. So, I decided to meet them, but this time, I prepared carefully. I told a close friend about the meeting, and they agreed to come along and wait nearby just in case things got out of hand. I also set up a recording on my phone to capture the entire conversation, so there would be no misunderstandings later. We agreed to meet at a neutral location, a quiet cafe on the edge of town. I arrived early and waited, feeling a strange mix of nerves and determination. My parents showed up right on time, and to my surprise, Jenna was with them, looking as though she was on a mission to win me over. As soon as we sat down, they launched into a heartfelt-sounding speech, talking about how they missed me and how family was all that mattered in the end. They shared fond memories, mentioning family holidays and traditions, doing everything they could to bring up nostalgic moments. I listened quietly, watching for any signs of genuine remorse. But their words quickly shifted, and soon enough, they were back to discussing Jenna's wedding. My parents started apologizing, but their apologies came with excuses. They described their actions as desperate measures taken out of love to keep the family together. They downplayed listing my house without permission, insisting they'd been pushed to the limit by the expenses of the wedding. It didn't take long before they were back to hinting at how a small contribution from me would solve everything. I stayed calm, repeating that I wasn't going to provide any financial assistance and that the house was absolutely not for sale. I told them that they'd crossed a serious boundary, and I had no intention of supporting an extravagant wedding that had nothing to do with me. My refusal seemed to shatter their composed front. My father, visibly frustrated, leaned in and accused me of turning my back on the family, saying I was ungrateful for all the sacrifices they'd made. He implied that everything they'd done for me over the years should be repaid now, when they needed me the most. My mother joined in, looking at me with a mix of disappointment and anger, reminding me how they'd always put family first and expecting me to do the same. Then Jenna, who had been sitting quietly until now, burst into tears. She accused me of ruining her dream day and called me selfish, acting as if her wedding was something I was obligated to support. She said she couldn't believe her own sister would deny her this one chance to have a perfect wedding. Her words were loud enough to draw the attention of people nearby, turning the conversation into a public spectacle. I kept my composure, knowing that any emotional response would only fuel their narrative. I calmly reminded them that my decision was final. I told them that the situation they found themselves in was a result of their own actions, and that I had no responsibility to fix it. I made it clear that if they attempted any further interference or continued trying to manipulate me, I wouldn't hesitate to pursue more legal actions. Realizing that their tactics weren't working, they fell silent. My parents looked at each other, visibly shaken by my refusal to cave in. Jenna seemed stunned, as though she hadn't expected me to stand my ground in front of everyone. I gathered my things, stood up, and walked away, leaving them sitting there in shock and disbelief. After that meeting, I felt an overwhelming sense of finality. For the first time, I felt like I had truly drawn the line and closed the door on their manipulative tactics. I knew they had no power over me anymore, and it felt liberating. Update 5. After the public confrontation, I made a firm decision to go fully no contact with my parents and sister. I blocked them on every platform and phone number, ensuring they couldn't reach me directly. I knew they wouldn't take it quietly, and sure enough, within days, their frustrations erupted on social media. My parents started posting about family loyalty and betrayal, painting themselves as the victims of a daughter who had turned her back on them. They emphasized their sacrifices and implied that I had abandoned the family when they needed me most. The fallout spread fast. I started getting messages from extended family members who had seen the posts. Some urged me to reconsider and reconnect with family, while others offered quiet support, telling me they'd heard my side and felt my parents had gone too far. A few relatives admitted they'd been blindsided by my parents' dramatic posts, but now saw how manipulative the whole situation had become. Around this time, I continued with therapy, which helped me unpack the emotional weight of cutting off my family. The therapist guided me in processing the guilt and doubt that lingered, reminding me that my boundaries were healthy and necessary. Working through these feelings gave me a stronger sense of self-worth and helped me realize that I wasn't responsible for fixing the mess my parents had created. My friends were my rock during this period. They rallied around me, making it clear I wasn't alone in my decision. We grew closer, becoming a kind of chosen family that I could rely on without fear of manipulation or judgment. Knowing I had people in my corner reinforced my choice to stand firm, and it helped me start viewing my home as a place of safety and independence again. At the advice of my lawyer, I documented every interaction and incident, even filing a report about my parents' attempts to list my home without my permission. This provided a paper trail, which gave me peace of mind, knowing I was legally prepared in case they tried anything else. The lawyer reassured me that I had solid grounds to protect my property and that my parents had no legal claim to my assets. Then, unexpectedly, I received a message from Jenna's fiancé. He apologized privately, admitting he hadn't understood the full extent of my parents' actions. He said he'd been caught up in the wedding planning and hadn't realized the pressure they were putting on me. While it was a bit of a surprise, I appreciated the apology. It was one of the few genuine moments in this entire ordeal. With my family out of the picture, I focused on securing my financial stability. I reviewed my finances and felt a deep sense of appreciation for the independence I'd built. The experience made me value my home even more, knowing I'd fought hard to keep it mine. I set up a financial plan to ensure that I could weather future challenges without needing anyone else's input, reinforcing my commitment to stand on my own. Word of my parents' actions began circulating among extended family members, and the tide started to turn. Some relatives distanced themselves from my parents, shocked by the lengths they had gone to manipulate me. The support was unexpected but reassuring. People were beginning to see that I wasn't the selfish person my parents had tried to paint me as. The family dynamic shifted, with some members openly criticizing my parents' behavior. As I moved forward, I found myself naturally gravitating towards new experiences and personal growth. I took up hobbies I'd always wanted to try, joined a local book club, and even threw a small housewarming with friends. It was the first time I'd hosted people in my home without any underlying tension or expectations, and it felt incredible. Reclaiming my space in a positive way reminded me that my home was now a symbol of my independence. Occasionally, my parents would try reaching out through distant relatives or through guilt-laden messages, but I ignored every attempt. I recognized these gestures as just another form of manipulation, a way to pull me back into their web. By now, I knew better. No amount of guilt-tripping would make me forget the way they treated me or the lengths they'd gone to in trying to control my life. Through mutual contacts, I learned that Jenna's wedding had been scaled down significantly due to financial constraints. There was a momentary pang of sympathy, but I quickly reminded myself that it was the outcome of choices she and my parents had made. They'd built up unrealistic expectations and dragged me into their plans without a second thought. I felt validated in having set boundaries and choosing not to enable their financial irresponsibility. The strain within the family continued, and I heard that my parents were struggling with the fallout. Some family members had started questioning their motives and actions, which seemed to be causing friction for them. Despite all this, I stayed firm in my no-contact decision, focusing on rebuilding my own life and leaving the family drama behind. Looking back, I realized how much I'd grown through this ordeal. Setting boundaries had been painful but necessary. I learned to prioritize my own well-being, and for the first time, I felt truly empowered. I shared my journey online, offering advice to others facing similar struggles, emphasizing the importance of self-respect and independence. The responses were overwhelmingly positive, with people thanking me for sharing my story and encouraging me to stay strong. In the end, I found peace in knowing that my future would be defined by respect and independence, not by manipulation or obligation. This journey taught me that family bonds shouldn't come at the cost of personal boundaries, and I was finally ready to move forward, leaving the past and the drama far behind.